Welcome to episode 194 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show the public who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to Timothy Gannon and Robert Burda. In this episode, Tim and Bob review a Fayetteville, North Carolina bank robbery case that, based on information from a confidential source, morphed into a murder-for-hire investigation. After the confession of one of the bank robbers, the murder victim's body was recovered from a shallow grave on the wooded reserves of Fort Bragg, an Army military base near Fayetteville. Tim Gannon and Bob Burda were assisted in this investigation by investigators from the Fayetteville Police Department, Army Criminal Investigative Division, CID, and other local law enforcement partners. The subjects pled guilty and received life sentences. You'll have the opportunity to read a longer bio in the show notes of this episode for Tim and Bob, but let me tell you a little bit about them now. Tim Gannon served in the FBI for nearly 28 years. His first two assignments were to Savannah and the State Bureau Resident Agency out of the Atlanta field office. He was permanently transferred to the Fayetteville Resident Agency out of Charlotte, North Carolina, after working there as an undercover agent on a long-term undercover case which targeted the theft of government property such as weapons and explosives. Tim was Bob Burda's training agent. Bob served in the FBI for 20 years. His first bureau assignment was to the Fayetteville RA, where he worked a wide variety of criminal investigations. He was promoted to supervisory positions at FBI headquarters. Prior to his retirement from the FBI, Bob was the unit chief at the National Joint Terrorism Task Force, where he was responsible for the administration of the 184 Joint Terrorism Task Forces around the country. Currently, Bob Burda serves as the Chief Strategy Officer for the Cybercrime Support Network, whose mission is to assist individuals and small businesses before, during, and after a cybercrime incident. There's a link to the Cybercrime Support Network website in the show notes for this episode. Before we get to the interview, I want to remind you that FBI Retired Case File Review will be on Podcast Row at CrimeCon in Orlando, Florida from May 1st to May 3rd. There's more information about CrimeCon on the homepage of my website, jerrywilliams.com, and that's Jerry with a Jerri, Williams.com. I also want to give a special shout out to listeners who volunteered to be beta readers for my next book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives, which will be published on March 25th, my birthday. You guys did a fantastic job searching for those pesky typos and grammar errors. And thank you for letting me know how much more you learned about the FBI from editing the book. And of course, I want to welcome new listeners. This podcast is all about true crime. But if you're also interested in crime fiction, I want to invite you to join my reader team, where once a month, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 50 books about the FBI, books written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. Nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You can join on my website or use the link in the description of this episode in your podcast app. I would love it if you also check out my books. All of my books are available wherever books are sold. I want to thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guests today, Bob Burda and Tim Gannon. Hi, guys. How you doing?
Good, Jerry. How are you today?
I am doing great, especially since I'm talking to two North Carolinians, and I soon will be one.
We're looking forward to your arrival.
All right. So the case that you are going to talk about today is another one of those just wild and crazy cases that starts out one way and then ends up in a different twist that you couldn't even imagine. And so which one of you wants to explain this case and how it starts?
So, Jerry, this is Bob, and I think I'll do that. It started almost, you hate to say routine, but it started as a routine bank robbery investigation. It was May 5th of 2000. I remember it was a nice afternoon. It was a Friday, and Friday afternoons, you hate to get a bank robbery call because instead of going home for the weekend, you're going to be going home late. We got to the bank. It was the First Citizens Bank. It's in an older section of Fayetteville. The Haymount section of Fayetteville, it's tree-lined streets, a lot of older homes, many of them restored. It's, the quiet section of Fayetteville, older businesses, some restaurants. It's kind of a nicer section. And we get to the bank that afternoon, and the police department was there and had already responded. And what we had was we had two white males enter the bank. And it was very interesting how they did it. They entered single file, one in front of the other, and they go into the front doors of the bank. As you go right in the doors, there's offices immediately to your right and an open area. And then the tellers are to the far left as you come in. They went in single file and they did a column left march, really, it's like a military marching. So now they're line abreast walking to the teller station. You don't usually see that in a bank robbery. They usually just walk right in the door, go right straight to the teller, and it's very different. They had a backpack and guns. They pulled the backpack out, and they pull out these Ziploc bags, and they tell the tellers, they were very specific. They said, no tracking devices, no die packs, no bait bills. And they give them these Ziploc bags and they tell them to fill the bags. And the tellers they're complying with the instructions. And one of the robbers, who later turned out to be one of our subjects, Arthur Hermes, he sees a bundle of 20s and the teller hasn't put them in yet. And he says, you can put those in. So the teller complies. It's going to figure into the story a little bit later. And
it sounds like a bad move on his part.
There were several bad moves on their part, but yeah, it was. They exited the bank together on foot and they disappear out the bank to the left. Like I said, it was a joint, the Fayetteville Police Department was there. I worked with them for many years while I was here, and I can't say enough good things about the detectives of the Fayetteville Police Department. They were really good detectives. They were great to work with. They always treated us fantastic. We worked very well together in many other cases aside from just these. But they were there. We had a joint investigation, and we reviewed the videotape and looked outside. And one of the things I forgot to mention, we kind of alluded to it, but as they exited the bank out the door to the left, you already called it, the die pack detonated. And we could tell that from the marks on the sidewalk that were pretty obvious. But other than the fact that we believe from the video and their basic, military marching entry into the bank, we believe that they were probably connected to the military in some way, shape, or form. But we really didn't have any leads at all other than that at that point.
Now, is there a military base? Well, I know the answer to this, but is there a military base nearby?
Yes, there is. Thank you for bringing that up. I should clear that up. It's obvious to me from having worked there, but the Fort Bragg military reservation is just a couple miles outside of Fayetteville proper. And that was part of the jurisdiction, our territory, if you will, at the Fayetteville Resident Agency where we worked.
It's actually one of the largest military bases the U.S. has. So this is very, very significant in terms of not only land, but also of a lot of troops stationed there.
Yeah, I mean, narrowing it down to even if you could say definitively it was 2 soldiers, I mean, there's probably 100,000 people to pick from with that description. So it hardly solved the case to say that. In any case, life goes on. And like I said, we sent a few things off to the lab, but nothing really came of anything.
I know we've moved past this point, but I think it's important to talk about the victims, the bank employees or the people in the bank, because sometimes we forget to mention them. I mean, here are 2 men coming into the bank with guns drawn. Did you have a chance to talk to any of them?
We did, Jerry, and we had quite a lot of bank robberies in my time there. And I have talked to at least dozens of, maybe into triple digits, of victim tellers over the years. And, it's a tough situation. It really is. And it becomes routine for us, but you really can't minimize that. And we had a definite protocol that we went through. We had victim specialists. We would put them in touch. We had resources that we would provide them. There was a number of things that are done for the victims in cases like that. The FBI has fantastic victim specialists that do such a great job with victims of crime. Approximately 2 months later, I remember I was home eating dinner and my cell phone rang, and it was some detectives from the Fayetteville Police Department that I'd been working with and had known very well. And they get me on the phone and they say, "Hey, Bob, remember that bank robbery from May?" I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Hey, we're talking to somebody now who knows who did that, but that person is also telling us about a homicide on Fort Bragg. And we think you need to get out here right now and talk to this person." And this person ultimately became a confidential witness. And you may hear me refer to the person as a he or a she. At this point, we don't want to, identify that person any further. But that person played a key role. I get the directions to where this place is, and it was going to take me leaving immediately and traveling as fast as I could, at least 90 minutes to get there. But, I hopped in the car and off I went. And this place was in the middle of nowhere.
Was it another police department or somebody's residence or?
As it was, Jerry, it was the residence of a police officer from a small town in a nearby county who was injured and was at home and wasn't working. And that's where this person had gone to. And that police officer contacted the Fayetteville police, who had then contacted me. We get out there and we hear the story, and this tells us who did the bank robbery. It was Arthur Cunningham Hermes, and that was the person who asked for the bundle of 20s. It was a guy by the name of Dean Arthur Kershaw, and there was a third guy. Actually, Dean Arthur Kershaw was the third guy. Going into the bank was Mark Allen Kirkbride. And those were the folks that did it. And all of them did have a connection to the U.S. military. Hermes had been dishonorably discharged, I'm going to say about a year before, but I don't remember exactly. And Dean Kershaw was currently listed as a deserter.
What, he had just walked off the base or something and never came back?
Right. And Tim, do you remember how long you had to be gone to be considered a deserter?
I think you have to not have shown up for 30 days.
So he had been gone for at least 30 days. And then the last guy, the other guy that went into the bank, Mark Kirkbride, he was currently in the U.S. Army at Fort Bragg, but he was on light duty after having some kind of injury, probably from a parachute jump or something. Maybe he sprained his ankle, or it wasn't a serious injury, but enough to keep him from training.
Kershaw and Kirkbride were in the same unit of the 82nd Airborne.
That's right. It's not often that you get somebody that tells you in such great detail what happened. We knew what happened in the bank, and when the CW told us what happened to the bank, it matched what we knew. But then the CW went on to talk about how Hermes and Kershaw had murdered an individual named Eric Carnes on Fort Bragg and buried him out there. Now, a lot of people are probably hearing that and wondering, now, how is that possible? So I probably ought to just explain a little bit about how Fort Bragg, I think it's still set up that way, but it's changed a little bit. But Fort Bragg is a huge geographic area. It covers several counties. And part of it, you never have to go through a gate. The Fort Bragg proper, you have to go through a gate and there's military guards and you have to show ID. But a large portion of the military reservation, you don't have to do that because it's just training areas and fields. There's no real buildings or anything on there. It's just troops maneuver through there. But the public is also allowed to access through the roads to get from one county to the next and so on and so forth. So it's definitely possible. And it wouldn't have been the first time that something like that happened out there. So the CW tells us this, and I remember looking at the Fayetteville PD detectives and pulling one of them aside and saying, do you guys even have a missing person report on this guy, Eric Carnes? And they said, we checked, we don't. That was kind of a problem for us. The CW said that, describes that they lured Carnes out there by telling him they found a marijuana grow out there that they wanted to harvest and basically steal from whoever planted it out there. And that they needed his expertise to do that. Carnes had a Cadillac that they drove out there. The CW said that when they got Carnes out close to where they had pre-dug a grave, they shot him in the head and buried him in the pre-dug grave.
Well, who is Carnes? Was he another, soldier?
He was not. Carnes, he worked at an establishment called the House of Dolls in Fayetteville, which was it was an adult.
Let me guess. Yeah, I was going to say, let me guess.
Yeah,
I know it had nothing to do with toys.
It didn't have anything to do with toys. No, it did not. But he was the manager there.
I think manager / kind of bouncer, wasn't he? Or
yeah, I think he did a lot of things there. But that was where he worked. So he was not in the military.
I hate to interrupt you, but this is a good teaching moment to explain to people why the FBI would have jurisdiction in a murder. Because most of the time, if it's a local murder, say if they had killed him somewhere in Fayetteville, that would be the end of it. You would be like, thanks for telling me, but I'll stick with the bank robbery. Could you explain why now you're sitting up in your chair and, really taking notes and why this is still going to be an FBI case?
Yeah, Jerry, this is Tim. I'll answer that question. The short answer is, Fort Bragg is a federal military reservation. So not in all cases, but in most cases, any crime that's committed on a government reservation can become a federal crime. There's some exceptions to that. There's parts of the base that are joint jurisdiction where the local can prosecute as well as the feds. But a lot of Fort Bragg is what they call exclusive federal jurisdiction. And that means those cases when the perpetrator is a civilian, in other words, somebody not in the military and not subject to the military laws, those people have to be prosecuted in federal court. Hence, why the FBI then has jurisdiction on those kinds of cases and routinely work those cases jointly and right alongside the military investigators, whether that's the military police or in this particular case, the Army's CID branch was actively involved in the investigation as well.
So as Tim just explained, we know at this point that the CW is talking about a federal crime and, obviously a serious federal crime. We have a homicide being committed out on Fort Bragg somewhere. At least that's the allegation at this point. The CW then tells us something else. The CW says that they took Carnes' Cadillac that they had driven out there with, and they drove it approximately an hour to probably the airport's probably an hour and a half north from the murder scene. And they parked it in long-term parking and left it unlocked with the keys in the sun visor, like on top of the sun visor. And their hope was that with, it was a nice, reasonably nice car, keys in it, And their hope was somebody would just steal it and that would be the end of it. And it would kind of, I guess, throw the light off of that and obfuscate the trail of what happened to him. The witness seemed very credible. The detail was good. You know, everything about how the witness was talking, you know, lent credibility to what they were saying, but the story was still pretty outrageous. The police didn't have a missing person report on this Eric Carnes. And, you know, this had supposedly happened several weeks ago. So really the only thing we could check was the car, at least right then and there. And I remember walking outside and calling on the phone, and it's a friend of mine at the Raleigh resident agency who was in charge, the agent in charge of their violent crime task force. And we had both come into the bureau about the same time. And I'm calling him at about 11 o'clock at night, knowing that this is not going to be a phone call that he wants to get. And he couldn't have been more gracious.
That's great.
And I called him up and I explained the story. And I asked him, I said, can either you or you have somebody go and check the Raleigh-Durham Airport RDU parking lot for this car? And I gave him the license plate and description. And he said, yep. He said, we'll get on it. And it was less than an hour. It was probably more like 40 minutes. My phone rang and they said, we got it here exactly like you said it would be. So now we're thinking
some of her story's been verified at this point.
Some of the story's been verified now. So we're going to start pressing on with this. It was an interesting evening. And when we got the call back that the car had been there, that really firmed things up for us. So they took it a step further for us. They impounded the car and they took it to CCBI, which is the City County Bureau of Investigation. And I had never dealt with that agency before. It was basically for Raleigh is in Wake County, and that was out of our territory. So we hadn't worked with them before, but they worked with the Raleigh resident agency a lot. And the City County Bureau of Investigation did all of the forensic work for the Wake County Sheriff's Department and the Raleigh Police Department. And it was kind of a combined agency. So they towed it to their forensic garage. They, kept it locked up there till we got a search warrant. And then they did the forensic exam for us, which was great. So the other thing that we do when we work cases like this on Fort Bragg, we don't do it on our own. Tim was the primary liaison to Fort Bragg at the time, and I'm sure it was Tim that contacted Army CID. And Army CID was the military law enforcement agency that we worked, I would say, the most with on Fort Bragg.
And that's the Criminal Investigative Division?
It is.
We got to break down these acronyms because we use a lot.
We do. So please stop me.
One thing that was kind of important about the car, as I recall, is that there was a parking ticket or some other kind of evidence that indicated to us a date time group that car showed up at the airport.
Yes.
So that then gave us a time frame as to when the reported murder had occurred, more so than we had prior to that. And we'll get into that date a little bit later, but it did give us a close to a more particular time as to when the murder had occurred.
You know what? You just said the word time, and I'm not sure if we've put a year on this, did we?
The bank robbery occurred May 5th of 2000.
Okay, and this CW
showed
came
up
to you?
At approximately July of 2000.
Okay.
By the time we assembled all the evidence and stuff, it was mid-August of 2000 when we had gotten the arrest warrants for the three, Hermes, Kershaw, and Kirkbride, for the bank robbery. We still didn't have a body. We still didn't have, we believed the CW, but we didn't have enough evidence to pursue that at this point.
What did you find out about Carnes? Did you find out eventually that he was missing, that no one knew where he was?
I think we were able to identify that there was, in fact, an Eric Carnes and validate the fact that there was such a person that worked at the House of Dolls there in Fayetteville. But as Bob said, there was never a missing person. I think we found out later in the investigation that maybe his family We did talk to some of his family. I remember particularly talking to his sister at one time, who might have suspected that he was missing, but they weren't in particularly that close of contact. They lived in another state, which I don't recall where that was at this time. But so we were able to figure out that there was such a person, and he did work where the CW said he worked. And we did find out later that he actually knew some of these folks, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well.
That explains why nobody, filed a missing person report. They're in another state, and they had no idea he was missing. They just thought that, he hadn't called his mother.
Right. There was no missing person report, but we couldn't find him either. It doesn't prove anything, but we couldn't find him either.
I know at some point we found out where his apartment was and things like that, but I don't recall.
We never could find him. But in any case, by mid-August, we had enough to get warrants for the bank robbery. So one of the other things that the CW had told us about Hermes and Kershaw was that they had been talking. They wanted to start a murder for hire business. That's what they wanted to do, and that they were armed. The CW said that they had body armor, numerous weapons, and also mentioned that they had said that they had fragmentation grenades that they had gotten from Fort Bragg. Now that sounds outrageous, and it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. So we were pretty concerned about the arrest plan, and we wanted to make sure that we did that correctly. Before I go on to talk about the arrest, we also found out through the CW that Hermes and Kershaw had been involved in several Western Union robberies on Fort Bragg. Those robberies were unsolved at the time, and we later found out that they were actually the people that did that. They weren't initially charged with that, but we did find that out ahead of time. So Hermes had a mobile home outside of Fayetteville proper, out in Cumberland County. And we enlisted the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office SWAT team. We worked very closely with the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office. And that's one thing about being in the RA is we had great relationships with the Sheriff's Department, the Police Department, with CID. And I can't say enough good things about all of these agencies, CCBI, and we'll try to list everybody at the end. And I just hope I don't forget anybody, but they were all fantastic. And we regularly worked with them hand in glove on lots of cases, not just this one. So we enlisted the Sheriff's Office SWAT team, and very early on Friday morning, they did a dynamic entry into the Hermes mobile home out in the county. And he wasn't there. So now, I kind of wrote in my notes that we had a short-lived, less than 24-hour, probably less than 12-hour fugitive investigation. As now we figure they're going to know that we're looking for him. So at this point, Tim, why don't we talk about, because you arrested Kirkbride.
As we normally try to do, these arrest things kind of tend to happen first thing in the morning. And as I recall, the arrest plan was for myself to go out to Fort Bragg and arrest this Mark Kirkbride individual, because we knew he was still stationed at Bragg, and we knew where we could put our hands on him pretty easily, and that was by getting him to his unit commander's office, which the CID coordinated, and he appeared there, at which time he was placed under arrest, and we then transported Kirkbride over to the CID office on Fort Bragg, and myself and a CID interviewed him, and he would eventually confess to his role in the bank robbery. As a side note, Kirkbride doesn't really have anything to do with the homicide part of the investigation. Kind of sort of knew of it, but was not a participant in it. So he was arrested on the bank robbery, confessed to the bank robbery, and would later plead guilty to the bank robbery. One kind of side note was kind of an interesting story is he knew, of course, where they had thrown the money. Bob alluded to earlier the dye pack going off. So everything that they had stuffed into that backpack that they had brought was now, stained with CS gas and red dye, and was basically unusable as kind of any proceeds. So they stuffed everything that they thought was incriminating into that backpack, and they drove to an area out of Fort Bragg called Lake Smith? Smith Lake, which is a recreational area, but it's also surrounded by a lot of wooded areas. But as part of my interview with him, he agreed to go out there and show us where they had thrown the backpack. And so he led us to the spot. He said, it's, you'll find it out, I don't know, throwing distance from the bank of this particular tree.
They threw it in the lake.
And, of course, there's somewhat of a funny story about that later. It took a little while for it to sink, but it eventually sank. And sure enough, when we went back a day or two later, we found that backpack. We got the Sheriff's Department dive team involved, and they came out there and probably within 10 minutes of hitting the water found the dye-stained backpack with all the dye-stained money and clothes and some rocks and stuff they used to weight the backpack down. So,
was there any usable money, or was it all ruined with the red dye?
It was pretty much all ruined, is my recollection. They just threw it all in there. So in the end, they basically got zero proceeds out of the bank robbery.
They did,
but we did recover that a couple. It wasn't that day, but it was a day or two later, because as you'll hear, some other events transpire later this particular day.
It was a long day.
Yeah, I think I get out of the picture for a while because I'm dealing with Kirkbride and his interview, and then if I recall, taking him to his first appearance and what have you up in Raleigh, which is, an hour or so away. So I'm out of the picture for a little while Bob's chasing these other guys around. So we'll return kind of to that story.
So as we left it off with Hermes, the Sheriff's Department hit his trailer and he wasn't there. As I recall, we found some weapons in the house, but nothing really of significance. And so we started working with CID, with Fayetteville PD detectives. And I remember I wound up in a Fayetteville Police detective car, as an unmarked car. And we were kind of, putting our heads together. All right, what do we, let's develop a plan to start looking for these guys. And I remember it was, I don't know, 1 o'clock or so in the afternoon, and I get a call from one of the CID guys that they had driven by Kershaw's estranged wife's residence in Fayetteville. And they said in the backyard, there was a car with a tarp over it. They said, we can't see the car, but we know it's a car with a tarp over it. And it looks to be the same size and shape as Hermes' car. And it looks to have been fairly recently put there. So that's pretty good lead. So, we kind of huddle up on the phone, if you will, and we get the CID guys. The plan is for them to get at the exits of the neighborhood and just kind of set up a surveillance. I'm with a Fayetteville police detective, and she was going to call in, and we're going to get the Fayetteville Police Department SWAT team to basically effect the arrest at the house. So that seemed like the most reasonable plan. And as we're trying to get the word back to the Fayetteville Police Department SWAT team, we decide that we're in a detective car. It's an unmarked car. Both of us are dressed in civilian clothes. Obviously, I'm dressed in civilian clothes all the time. And we would just drive by the house so we could get an eye on the house, and we could give the SWAT team, a better idea of what to expect and, what type of house it was. And so they could plan for what they were going to do. And, sometimes signals get crossed. We are driving up the house, and we were the plan is for us just to drive by and look at the house and try and remember as much as we can remember from looking at the house. And as we drive up, we see 2 or 3 Army CID cars pull into the driveway. Agents hop out with their weapons drawn and start running up to the door.
Well, wait a minute. How did that happen? You were going to use the police department.
I don't remember exactly. There was some reason they had for doing it.
And he's still in the military.
Kershaw is. But he's the deserter, but technically he's still in the military.
Okay. So that's why CID would still be arresting him, even though you're also working the bank robbery.
It's a federal warrant. They don't really have jurisdiction so much off post, but they're there to help us effect that federal arrest warrant.
At that point, it was on. There was no hiding anything at that point. So we stopped the car and the two of us hopped out. It wasn't the most tactical of plans, but sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. I guess the two guys saw a bunch of armed law enforcement people, running towards the front door, and they surrendered immediately. So it came out all right.
So they're both in there?
They were. So we have Arthur Hermes and Dean Kershaw, and we arrest both of them. I remember my first conversation with Hermes. When I first talked to him, he had been placed on his knees. He had his hands behind his back. He was handcuffed. He was wearing a sweatshirt and jeans, I think. And when I first went up to him, I said, Arthur Hermes. And I said, hey, I'm Bob Burda with the FBI. We have a warrant for your arrest. And he said something to the effect of, I'm not Arthur Hermes. That's not my name. I'm somebody else. And the CW had told us about a very distinct tattoo that he had on his forearm. So his arms are handcuffed behind him. And I just reached back and I remember sliding the sleeve of his hoodie up, and I saw the exact tattoo that had been described. And I remember just coming back around and I said, well, sir, we believe you're Arthur Hermes. So we're going to take you down to the police department and we're going to fingerprint you. And if it turns out that you are not Mr. Hermes, I will personally drive you back here, with my apologies. When we got him back to the police department and we asked him his name, it was magically Arthur Hermes. I think he knew it was up. Jerry, I got to tell you about this house.
This is the ex-wife's house?
It is.
Okay.
She wasn't ex.
She actually wasn't ex. Yeah. He had left her. I think they had 3 kids.
At least 3, yeah.
If the oldest was in first or second grade, maybe even kindergarten, the oldest. And then there were 2 younger than that. We asked the CW, who had told us that Kershaw had left his wife. Yeah, I remember asking the CW, why did he leave his wife? And the answer was, I guess it was true, but the answer was that his wife couldn't keep the house clean. And I remember hearing that and thinking to myself, are his legs broken? He can't clean up the house himself a little bit?
And she has 3 kids under 5 or 6.
Right. Well, that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking, boy, that's not, I'm not thinking very highly of him at that point.
All right. Tell me about the house. I can't wait now.
Well, Jerry, to say that the house wasn't clean was like the biggest understatement. I mean, it was unbelievable. In my 20 years in the FBI, I've seen some pretty horrendous houses. This was by far the worst. They had 18 cats, no litter box. Every square inch of the floor of that house, there was no place you could step, and then there's no nice way to say it, without stepping on dried cat excrement.
Oh, no.
The smell you can only imagine.
And 3 little kids living there.
And on top of that, Jerry, it gets worse.
I don't know how it could get worse.
So the kids had used the cat excrement. They had written all over the walls in the cat excrement. I can't make you can't make this up. You cannot make it up. It was absolutely the worst. And the kitchen, you can only imagine the kitchen. It was horrible. Absolutely horrible. Absolutely the worst house. And I remember thinking, I guess the CW was telling us the truth about not keeping a clean house.
Mm.
It was beyond the laundry wasn't folded.
And so what happens? What's the law enforcement responsibility when you see something like that?
We had to get the kids out of there.
Yeah. Wow.
So we called Child Protective Services. The police department had all the connects with Child Protective Services. And the one thing I remember, this is late on a Friday.
Friday too, wasn't it?
Friday afternoon. Seems like everything in this case happened on a Friday. And we were having a hard time getting Child Protective Services out there on a Friday afternoon. And they said, well, we'll come by on Monday. And, the people at Fayetteville PD that we work with, I can't say enough good stuff about them. One of their sergeants got on the phone and he basically said, he basically called them on the carpet and he said, I'll tell you what, And I'll never forget, because I only heard his side of the conversation on the phone. But he just said, I'll tell you what. He said, this is the worst house I've ever seen. You need to come and get these kids out of here. And if you're not here in like 45 minutes, I'm calling the news media and I'm going to give them a tour of the house and I'm going to tell them you couldn't get out here until Monday. Okay. They were out there in a half an hour.
Yeah, I would imagine so. But, these are the things that, that you come across, when you're an agent or a police officer that just never leaves you,
Oh, that was, we could tell you another story about some other houses that we've been through, but yeah, that was by far the worst. And like I said, the worst part about it was those kids. And, I had boots on and was thankful to have had the boots on. Those kids were barefoot. It was terrible.
This is now like on or about August 25th or something, I think. So, it is the heat of summer in North Carolina. So you can only imagine the magnification of the smell in that house.
Yeah, it was, again, this is the worst I've seen, and I've seen some pretty bad houses. So to move the story along, Hermes and Kershaw are transported to the Fayetteville Police Department. Kershaw, pretty much right off the bat, invokes his right to an attorney and says nothing. So pretty much nothing with Kershaw. Hermes, he decides he wants to talk with us. And he pretty quickly gives up the bank robbery and confesses to the bank robbery. And, to be honest, I still remember this part of the conversation as almost humorous, the way he described this bank robbery. He had read a newspaper or a magazine article, I think it was in Maxim magazine, about how to do a bank robbery. And I remember him telling me they had cased the bank a couple times and done some, observations of it before they actually did the robbery. But there were three of them involved. Hermes and Kirkbride were the ones that went into the bank. Kershaw was the getaway driver. We never saw him, and he wasn't on any of the video. We never, we didn't know about him from the initial investigation. The CW told us about it, but, we didn't see him based on just what we knew from going to the bank that day. And the magazine article, and you remember I said when he walked in, he told them no bait bills, no die packs, no tracking devices.
Right. I guess this was what to do if you commit a bank robbery kind of article.
Right. That's where he got that from. And the Ziploc bags, his idea was that if he had a Ziploc bag and he did get a die pack, it would isolate the damage just to that bag. I can tell you that doesn't work. When that goes off, it just obliterates the plastic bags. So, if anybody out there is listening and thinks that would be a good idea, it doesn't work. So he talks about it, and he said, the teller was doing what I said. I asked him for that bundle of 20s, and that was it. So he knew it was his fault, essentially, and he told us so. He thought we knew about the bank robbery. He goes, you got it from the handprint on the door, didn't you? And, I just kind of nodded, and we didn't. And he had said that Kirkbride had gone out the door first. And in their rehearsal, they had pulled their hoodie sleeves over their palm to push out the door. And he saw that Kirkbride didn't do that. He forgot to do that. And he put his palm right on the door. And he said, I tried to wipe the door as I left behind him, because that's how we got caught. Or at least that's what he believed. And I was just as happy to let him believe that at that point. So they exit the bank on foot to the left, and almost immediately the die pack detonates. I sent you a picture before, Jerry, of the bank, and it might be helpful if you looked at that. But as they came out to the left, and
yeah, it looks like it's in the middle, like a little tiny one-room bank in the middle of nowhere. Very rural.
Well, believe it or not, it's actually in the city.
More like kind of on the edge of a neighborhood, really.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just didn't really see any properties next to it.
Yeah. It's not the best picture in the world. But anyways, they went out to the left, and you can't really see it. And I think it may have changed a little since that picture, from 2000 to when that picture was taken. But there was about a 6-foot high wood fence and the property adjacent, which was an apartment complex. at that time of day, there wasn't a lot going on. And that's where the getaway car was parked. And they had borrowed a car. They didn't use their own car. They borrowed a car from someone, and this person didn't know what they were using it for. They just said, hey, can we borrow your car? That person was at work. It was like their spare car. They said, sure. I don't think that person ever even really knew the car was gone. But Kershaw was in that car. He was the getaway driver. And the plan was that Kirkbride and Hermes would get in the trunk of the car because they thought the police would be looking for two white males. And if they were both in the trunk and Kershaw was driving, there'd only be one white male in the car, and that would confuse the police. So that was the plan. Well, you remember I told you Kirkbride was on light duty? Well, Kirkbride had been on light duty for a while and had put on a few extra pounds at this point. And so Hermes is telling us this story. And of course, this is a story of a bank robbery gone wrong. They get 2 feet out the bank. The die pack goes off. They run to the fence where they're going to just hop over the fence and then hop into the trunk, get away, return the car. Nobody who knew that had the car would have been the wiser. They'll get into their own car and they'll go off with all the bank robbery proceeds is the plan. So Hermes gets to the fence first. He climbs over, and Kirkbride is in a physical condition where he can no longer get over the fence by himself. And Hermes had a few choice words about that because he had to now climb back over the fence. He describes himself getting down on all fours. Oh, God. So that Kirkbride can step on his back and get over. And then, so anyways, eventually they all get over the fence.
This is not the way it happens in the movies.
No, it's not. In fact, it was very hard not to laugh as he's telling me this story. And then he proceeds to describe the car that they had. And I don't remember the make and model, but it was a compact car with a small trunk. And it was a fairly warm day in Fayetteville. And these guys are now, the die packs, it's not just dye, it's CS gas, which is unpleasant. And so now he's getting in the trunk with this guy who's a little overweight, pretty big, and they're both covered in CS gas on a hot day in Fayetteville in the afternoon. And he describes how fun it was to get in the trunk with this guy, have the trunk closed, and then ride for 10 or 15 minutes back to their car. So, he's telling us this story, and it's very hard not to laugh at this whole story. So they get to where they were returning the car, and they feel safe, and they take an inventory, and they see that there's not a single bill that doesn't have dye stain on it, not one. Some of their clothes were dye stained, and they decide to chalk it all up to experience. They stole a couple landscaping bricks from the house where, near that they had borrowed the car from. They threw the landscaping bricks, all the money, all their clothes. They stuffed it into the bag, and they go out to Smith Lake, and they walk around. And we sent you a picture of that too. And that's kind of the recreation area. That they didn't throw it off the beach. They went around to the wooded area, and they get there and they throw the backpack out in the water, and the thing floats.
I knew you were going to say that. So now they got to go in and fish it out?
Well, they're looking at it and they're going, let's just get out of here. And they say they're walking away, and they say this young kid happens to see it, and he's close enough that he sees it, and he sees him walking away, and he starts yelling at him. He goes, "Hey, mister, you forgot your bag." So now they're like, they can't leave. So at this point, one of them grabbed some straws, and they were drawing straws to see who was going to swim out and sink the bag. And they said as they were picking the straws, they looked over, and it slowly started to sink. And so when it sank, they left. So bank robbery didn't go too well for them.
Yeah, no, it did not.
At this point, we get all of the bank robbery information in his interview, and he confesses to that. I am in the interview room with him with another Fayetteville Police Department detective. And, I've already said it a couple times, but they are so good. They do a great job. At this point, we turn the discussion. We say, okay, hey, that's great. You gave us a bank robbery. We appreciate that. Thank you. We need to talk to you about something else. And we bring up Eric Carnes. And where it was lighthearted, kind of almost, he's telling us this funny story about a bank robbery that had gone wrong from his perspective. The whole mood of the room is now much, much more serious. I don't think he had any idea that we even knew Eric Carnes was dead, let alone that he had some involvement in it. And I think that really
shook him up.
He had no idea. I mean, you could have knocked him over with a feather when we brought that word up. I had taken a turn in the interview about, working on him to give us the information about that and to confess. And, frankly, it wasn't working. And the Fayetteville detective, she did a great job. And she kind of did the little, we had worked together many times, and she kind of kicked me under the table a little bit. And I nodded to her, and she took off, and she did a great job. She just took it in a different direction. Her name is Carolyn Pollard, and she did a fantastic job with that interview. She really did. What she said to him, really kind of hit a chord with him, and he confessed. And he told us what happened. And, he told us everything that the CW had told us and a few things more.
So you got to tell us, what did she say to him?
Well, I don't think it's a good idea to do that, Jerry.
Okay.
She was very, very skillful in how she handled that.
All right. Can we say that she was compassionate or respectful? I mean, it wasn't one of those good cop, bad cop that now she's threatening him or coercing him.
I think it was really a good cop kind of thing. But, there's many different ways you can talk to people. And, she just took it down a different lane. And you never know what's going to resonate with somebody. And that just happened to resonate with him. Once he got started, he pretty much gave it all. And sometimes people will give you just a little tidbit or just a little admission and they'll stop. But
I think it's important to know, Jerry, that Bob summarized this in a couple of minutes, but this is an interview that went on for, in my memory, because I eventually show up when this is going on back from court. I mean, over several hours.
Yes.
To get from, point A to the final piece where he gives up the murder. So it's kind of important. I mean, it wasn't, a 10 or 15 minute conversation. This was several hours of working on this guy to get the truth.
Yeah, that's true. And that's important to remember because it kind of rolls into what we're going to tell you next. But, this isn't just the Bob and Tim show going on here. I mean, we're the ones talking to you, but there was lots of people working this. So what he tells us in essence is, Hermes and Kershaw were essentially working for Carnes. I'm sure they didn't have W-2s on file or anything, but essentially they were working for Carnes. Carnes had a dispute, and Tim, you probably can fill this part in a little bit more, with a guy by the name of Jamie Tabbitt. In my recollection, it was a minor drug dispute, and I can't remember what it was, like over $100 worth of marijuana or something. Do you remember?
This group also got into some, I would describe as some relatively minor drug dealing. And that's kind of how they ended up knowing each other and working with each other as well. And we'll talk about this guy, Jamie Tabbitt, towards the end of the interview. But he's another player, and he and Carnes had a dispute, which leads to this murder, if you will. But there's kind of a twist to it, is that we'll get to in a few minutes.
Well, basically what Hermes tells us is that Carnes basically wanted to pay Hermes and Kershaw to kill Tabbitt over this drug dispute. But Hermes and Kershaw weren't that happy with Carnes and weren't getting along with him very well. And so instead of killing Tabbitt, they approached him and they told him that Carnes was going to pay them to kill him. And they asked Tabbitt how much he would pay them to kill Carnes. They come to an agreement. I believe the agreement was $15,000. Is that
sounds right?
Yeah. So
that is, who thinks of that?
No, you can't make this up.
Yeah. What kind of plan? I'm going to kill this guy, but look, if I'm going to kill him anyway, maybe I can make some money off of it.
I think it's important to note too that, I mean, Kershaw is a deserter. Hermes has been thrown out of the Army. These guys don't have jobs. They don't really have any money. Hence, the bank robbery that didn't go very well. So they're still trying to figure out how to get some money, which I believe leads them to trying to flip the tables, to make some money on this killing. I think that's their motivation behind it, is try to make a buck. But Tabbitt is really not, this guy's not money bags as you come out in the story. But, Tabbitt probably had no intention of ever paying that $15,000 because, number one, he didn't have it.
Yeah. So, but he tells them he will. And so they come up with this plan to, and you've heard this part before because we told you what the CW told us, which was a plan to lure Carnes out to a remote area in Fort Bragg and, basically tell him they need his help to steal a marijuana crop they found growing out there. There was no marijuana crop growing out there, but there was a grave that they had pre-dug. They drove out late at night. I also sent you a Google Earth photo of the approximate area where that was found, and you can see that part of Fort Bragg is a lot of tall pines. It's very remote, and it's interspersed with what are known as fire roads, and they're basically just dirt roads, I guess, to allow fire vehicles. If there's a fire breaks out in the forest, they can get in there, and military vehicles can get in and out for training purposes and so on. But these are not typically suited for your typical passenger car to go back and forth on. So that's where they were. They drove out there. They'd get them out in the woods, and Hermes is supposed to shoot him. And he says, I couldn't do it. And so they made up a story about, it's too dark, we can't find the marijuana, let's go buy some flashlights. So they all pile back into the car. They drive back to the nearest civilization, to a convenience store to buy flashlights, which they do. But at some point, Hermes and Kershaw are by themselves without Carnes during this trip. And Kershaw just says, give me the gun, I'll do it. And so Hermes gives Kershaw the gun that they had that night. And they got back out there right near the grave, and Kershaw did it. He shot him in the back of the head while he was walking in front of him. Eric Carnes never knew what was going to happen. So they buried him in the grave they had dug, and they took his car and they put it in long-term parking at RDU. He told us that, but he didn't know that we had found it there. And the most important part, he agreed to take us out to where Carnes was buried, and we felt that we needed to do it right that night, so that he didn't have a chance to change his mind. And I think it was about 11 o'clock at night. At this point, I'm going to turn the story over to Tim.
Yeah, so Bob and Carol did a great job and got this confession out of the guy. So obviously we want to try to find the body. So we caravan out there. I mean, I think it was us. It was the Fayetteville PD. It was some cadaver dogs, Army CID. It was kind of, a 6 or 7 car entourage out in the middle of nowhere, Fort Bragg, just no civilization anywhere around. And he leads us at first to the general area. I think the first time we go down the wrong road, and then he realizes, no, this is the wrong road. And second attempt in, we find it, and he basically says it's right over there. And Bob gets out of the car, and we're going to get
as I remember, Tim, we went on a fire road that was essentially perpendicular to Plank Road, the main paved road, and we went down past at least two side roads, and he stopped. He says, "It's down there."
Right, it's down there. Yeah.
And that road was impassable to vehicles. And my recollection was that you, myself, and we brought him in handcuffs down that road because there was like trees across the road. And we walked down some ways in the darkness with flashlights, and he said, "There."
Kind of pointed right to where it eventually ended up be. And I think you walked in there.
You called on the radio to say, "Bring the dog down." And while we were waiting for the dog, I figured I'd go in and take a look around into the wooded area off the very rough dirt road. And I remember having mixed emotions about going in there because I thought, geez, maybe I'll screw up this cadaver dog if I'm walking around in here. So I walked around, I got my flashlight, I don't see anything. The dog gets there. I'm still, in the wooded area. And so I just decided I'm going to turn my light off. I'm just going to stop right here and just let the dog do what the dog does. And I remember the dog stopped right in front of me and indicated. And it was very dark out there, Jerry. And all I remember thinking is, I screwed up the dog. I turned my light on, and unbelievably, about 3 inches in front of my toe, you could see the tip of his skull sticking out of the sand.
Wow.
He was right there. If I had taken another step, I probably would have stepped on him.
Somebody, maybe years from there would probably have found this guy on some Army maneuvers or something. But even though part of his body was protruding, he was still, for the most part, buried. At that point, we obviously knew that, okay, this murder story is for real. We've already got Army CID involved. And actually, at the time, we call Special Agent in Charge, SAC. The Army CID calls them the SAC, but still it's the Special Agent in Charge. Was a very good friend of ours, still remains to be a very good friend of ours, still lives in the area, a guy named Paul Pierce. And we work very closely on a lot of cases at Fort Bragg with Paul. And he basically concurred that we need to, we'll secure the scene. We'll get some military police down here, and we will try to excavate this body the next day. He wanted us to get the FBI's evidence response team, the ERT, from Charlotte in there.
By the next day, Jerry, that's going to mean Sunday, because now we're into Saturday. It's like 1:00 in the morning on Saturday.
We started making some phone calls. We got in touch with the our Charlotte division of the FBI's evidence response team. A good friend of ours, Eric Davis, I think, was leading the team at that particular time. Eric's still in the Charlotte division. He's actually a supervisor there now. But they come down and they help excavate this body of Eric Carnes. And Eric Carnes is not a small guy. I would describe him, probably 6 foot, 300 pounds, maybe.
Yeah.
At the time. So it was a large body to try to recover out of this hole in the ground. And kind of remarkably, I guess, since he was in the kind of the cooler ground, remember, this is the heat of summer at Fort Bragg. He was actually pretty well preserved, if you will. Once we were able to recover him, once again, he had one of these distinctive tattoos that we had been made aware of. And while his face, you remember Bob talking about the skull being exposed, the face and stuff was pretty much degraded, but we were able to see this tattoo. And I don't remember what the tattoo was, but we were pretty much able to confirm that in fact was Eric Carnes. So the excavation's done, the recovery's done, and Carnes is taken to the basically the hospital there at Fort Bragg, the military hospital, in preparation for an autopsy. One of the protocols that the Army CID used there for these death investigations, they would call in doctors and workers from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, which is AFIP. They're specialists at doing these kind of autopsies, and they came down and performed the autopsy there at the hospital at Fort Bragg that same day, later that same afternoon. So, additional evidence, Mr. Carnes' clothing and fingerprints and those kind of things were all collected and preserved for later use in the investigation. So based on, Hermes' confession, finding the body, now we're in a full-blown death investigation. And let me explain a little bit more about Fort Bragg and the surrounding area. For federal prosecutions, we always go by the judicial district, where the crime occurs. For the most part, there's some exceptions to that. But in the state of North Carolina, for example, there's the eastern, the middle, and the western districts of North Carolina. The bank robbery having occurred in Fayetteville was in Cumberland County, which is in the eastern district of North Carolina. And we had a fine prosecutor, AUSA Tom Murphy, who prosecuted that particular part of the case, and would really have loved to prosecute the murder. But as it turns out, the murder actually happened in a different county, which is called Hoke County, Hoke. Hoke County actually falls in the middle district of North Carolina. So we had to get an additional U.S. Attorney's Office involved, and that's eventually where they would be charged. Different from the bank robbery, they would be charged in the middle district of North Carolina, and we had another fine AUSA involved in that prosecution as well. So they eventually, after the evidence and Hermes' confession and stuff, those guys get indicted for the murder case. And we go through the discovery process and finishing up, the evidence exams and all that kind of stuff that we had done, additional interviews, things of that nature. There's a discussion about whether they're going to prosecute the death penalty or not. There's some preliminary negotiations going on with these guys' attorneys. And, eventually some plea agreements are met, and both Hermes and Kershaw both agree to plead guilty to the murder, and the death penalty is taken off the table. It's kind of a joint agreement, if you will, that wouldn't be pursued. So we get a chance to talk to Hermes and Kershaw. Again, Kershaw never told his story to begin with, but he tells his story and corroborates this pretty much the same story that Hermes had done. In fact, admitted that he was the shooter, and the whole story about leading him out there to a marijuana field, etc. So they agreed to plead guilty, but in one of these things, it comes out this whole discussion about this Jamie Tabbitt individual. And as Bob alluded to earlier, they talk about having Tabbitt had hired them to do this murder. Keep in mind now, we recovered the body in late August of 2000. By the time we go through the process and these guys plead guilty, it's probably now 2002 time frame. And we get this additional information about this Jamie Tabbitt guy. And really, the only way that I could think of, myself being the case agent on the murder part and Bob assisted me, and vice versa, I assisted Bob on the bank robbery, was that we would try to run an undercover operation and try to get an undercover agent to have a discussion with Tabbitt to see if he could get some admissions from him about having this transpired. And I was a big fan of trying to do that. I'd been an undercover agent myself, and I really believed in the technique. So we recruited another agent who at the time was from the Newark division. He's still an active agent, so we won't go into his name. But we got him recruited, and he agreed to do the approach to Tabbitt. And the plan that we came up with was that, first of all, we'd have agents up in Pennsylvania. Tabbitt was now living in Pennsylvania, if I forgot to mention that aspect, which is where he was from. Verified where Tabbitt lived up there, got an address and a physical location. And we were going to send the undercover up there under the premise that he was being sent by Kershaw. If you remember, Kershaw had a family. He had the wife and the 3 kids. Although he didn't take particular care of them, Tabbitt probably didn't know all that backstory. So we wanted the undercover to approach him in the aspect that, hey, we never talked about you. You can see, we're in jail. You're not. So clearly we never gave you up. In the way that I wanted to convey that, I came up with an idea from somewhere that I got a piece of loose leaf paper, just like, a kid would have in school. And I got a pencil and I wrote a handwritten letter, if you will, to make it look like Kershaw had written this letter in jail to Tabbitt. And the undercover agent was going to pose as a guy that just got out of jail recently and was a cellmate of Kershaw's. And Kershaw was like, hey, you're getting out of jail. I want you to take this letter, track this guy down for me, and deliver him this letter. So that was the plan that we proceeded with. And I think around December, right before Christmas, December of 2002 at this point, the undercover agent takes the letter up there, rings the doorbell at Tabbitt's house. Tabbitt answers the door, and the undercover basically tells him that he's here. He's got this letter to deliver. Tabbitt makes some kind of comment that he's been waiting for this day. I don't remember the exact quote, but he'd been waiting for the day where somebody was going to show up to talk to him. For about 45 minutes or so, they stand there at the door and have a conversation about this. And Tabbitt agrees that he needs to take care of Kershaw's family, that he had gotten these folks into this, and that he, in fact, had hired them to do this killing, and that he agreed to pay them for them and never have. And so he agrees that all that's true and that he'll set up to get some money. Well, Tabbitt doesn't have any money. I don't even recall if he really even had a job at the time. But he agrees that he'll come up with some money, and the undercover agent agrees, well, I'll come back in about 30 days, and you can give me a payment. It also allows us to collect some additional evidence. I might not have said, all these conversations are, of course, being recorded by the undercover agent. So it's not just the undercover agent's words. It's Tabbitt's own words that are basically sealing his fate as this goes down. So they make that arrangement, and I'll be back in a month. I'll collect this money. Like I said, Tabbitt didn't really have a whole lot of money, but a month later, they have another meeting up there in Pennsylvania. Once again, the undercover agent, I think this time they meet at a restaurant, and he said, man, this is all I can come up with. And he gives the undercover agent $100.
$100.
$100, right.
Wow. On that payment plan, by the time he's finished, I'll be out of jail.
Right. And the undercover agent does a fantastic job. He's just a great, great undercover agent. And, he plays that out because, I'm not going to come up here every month to get $100. I mean, we're going to have to do something. I'll come up here next month. You try to get some more money, but I'm not driving over here for $100 a month for the next, however many years it's going to take. We'll have to figure out something where you can Western Union the money or some kind of thing where I don't have to be involved in coming and get this money. So he agrees to that. The second meeting is set up. By that time, based on the tapes and everything that the undercover agent has provided, we have enough to charge Tabbitt in a murder for hire case. So we've, at that point, indicted Tabbitt back in the Middle District of North Carolina. Arrest warrant is issued for him. And on that second meeting where he's supposed to pay additional money, the agents up there in Pennsylvania arrest Tabbitt and take him into custody there in Pennsylvania. I'm up there as well. This is now probably, January, February of 2003. And I get an opportunity to interview Tabbitt that afternoon, that evening. We interview him, I think, at a local highway patrol station. He doesn't come 100%, but, he makes a lot of admissions about, knowing these guys and having been in business with him and, generically speaking, having entered this arrangement. I think he was a little hesitant to admit that they had actually gone through with it. He kind of shaded that a little bit, but he made some significant information.
Do you know if he knew for sure that they had? Did they bring him any proof that they had gone through with it?
There wasn't any, cutting off of fingers or pictures or anything like that. But they had told him they had done it, and of course, Tabbitt knew Carnes was no longer around because Tabbitt was in North Carolina at that point in time. So he knew in his gut and that these guys had told him. But that was kind of what the party had trouble coming forth in the interview. So anyway, later on, Tabbitt pleads guilty to a murder for hire charge there in the Middle District of North Carolina. He got a sentence of 10 years for that. I looked it up the other day. He actually got out of prison in July of 2012, which would be, around the 10-year mark. Kershaw and Hermes are doing life on top of the bank robbery and robbery charges they had. And
they also charged, I think they did charge those Western Union robberies as well. Yeah.
There was another player that I'll throw in here at the end. There was a military police guy, a non-commissioned officer. I think he was maybe an E6, which is like a staff sergeant in the Army. He also was associated with the House of Dolls through his wife, who was a
entertainer.
Entertainment specialist, if you will. Yeah, she was a dancer there at the House of Dolls. So he knew all these guys. And it turns out when I interviewed him back earlier in the investigation, he admitted that he had known that a murder had occurred. And not just because he was an MP, but, that would be anybody's duty to report that. But especially since he was a military policeman, he certainly had a duty to report that, and he didn't. So we actually back in the Eastern District with AUSA Tom Murphy, ended up charging him or making some kind of a plea agreement with him where he pled guilty to misprison of a felony, which is understanding and knowing that a felony occurred, in this case, this murder, and not taking the appropriate actions to report it to the competent authority.
Let me get an understanding. Had you interviewed him during your investigation?
Yes.
He had denied, or he just didn't bring it. He didn't even mention it.
I want to say that we interviewed Jason Beverly on around the time of the original arrests.
Okay.
And he had told us then that he knew. We ended up having to circle back around after some other things had settled down and convinced the AUSA that he needed to be charged as well.
Oh, absolutely. As a military police officer, definitely he had a duty to, report that.
So that's kind of in the end how it kind of all wrapped up. I mean, we know that Kershaw and Hermes, as I said, are doing life. They're still in federal prison. They'll be there forever. And that's kind of sort of the most part, I think, how the story ends.
Yeah. It came a long way from a warm afternoon in May.
As strange as the case is, I did another interview, episode 157, with an agent from the Wilmington RA out of Baltimore, and the same thing happened to him. He was initially doing a bank robbery investigation, And in the course of doing the bank robbery investigation, he learned that the guy he had for bank robbery had killed his mother just a couple of days after the bank robbery. So it was another wild and crazy case like this. It really is an indication of, how you don't know what you got when you start working one of these cases.
I mean, usually it's not uncommon to obviously hear about shootings or, even tellers or bank employees, are occasionally shot at or even killed during robberies. I mean, it's not that often, but it does occur. Or even sometimes the robbers will turn on each other and kill each other over the proceeds or whatever. But it's somewhat unusual for kind of a totally unrelated crime. Basically, these guys ended up going on a crime spree for a couple months. It's probably an easy way to describe it. From the bank robberies to the Western Union robberies to the dope dealing to, and then killing Mr. Carnes. It was just, they were just a bad act at the time. Exactly.
Yeah, you never know.
And of course, in this particular case, as we talked about earlier, if they hadn't killed him on Fort Bragg, the FBI's, interest in that would have not been nearly as high. We may have helped the Fayetteville PD be working on a homicide where they were the lead investigative agency, but just kind of turns out since Fort Bragg was involved, we ended up being the lead investigative agency.
All right. So after, hearing about your work, my question is, when did you join the FBI and why did you join the FBI? Tim, since you were last talking, why don't you go first?
Okay. Well, I joined the FBI in 1989. I retired almost exactly 3 years ago in 2017. I think that turns out to be 27 years. Savannah, Atlanta, and Charlotte divisions. Prior to the FBI, I was in the Army, assigned in the infantry, served in Hawaii, and then I was assigned to a Special Forces unit here at Fort Bragg for a couple of years, and had always been interested in the FBI. Kind of rekindled my interest in the FBI and started going through the hiring process, and was eventually fortunate enough to get hired. I don't think that I probably would have left the Army unless they asked me to. Would have left the Army to go anywhere else other than the FBI.
What made you interested?
Like a lot of folks my age, from watching the FBI TV show with Efren Zimbalist Jr. back in the day. I remember watching that as a kid, but no, I didn't know anybody in the FBI. Didn't have any, family that had been in the FBI before. It was just something that was in the back of my mind, and something came up where I heard about, the hiring process, and I said, I ought to look into that. And so I did. And about 2 years later, I ended up in the FBI.
And so once you retired, what are you doing now?
Kind of back in the Army. I stayed here in the Fort Bragg area. I work for a private company that contracts back to the Army to provide bodies back to the Army. So for the last 3 years, I've been, as we call a contractor, work at Fort Bragg every day with the Special Operations Command, and I have certain duties and responsibilities helping the Army run their daily business.
All right, Bob. When did you join the FBI, and why did you join the FBI?
So I joined the FBI in March of 1998. Prior to that, I had been in the Navy for about 10 years. So when I joined the FBI, I was just a couple months away from my 37th birthday, which for those who don't know is kind of the last call for joining the FBI. You can't be 37 years old when you're sworn in to the FBI as an agent. That's kind of the upper limit. I think there's some exceptions now for some military folks, but in general, and certainly in my case, that was it. I had some friends that I was in the Navy with that had joined the FBI and had told me great things about it. As a kid, I was interested in the FBI, but I never thought, it just never occurred to me that would be something for me until some of my Navy friends had done it. And I was like, well, I did all the stuff they did in the Navy. I could do that. Gotten out of the Navy for 3 years. I was working for a big company, and, I was doing fine, but I really missed the service aspect of work. And so it took a while. There was hiring freezes and some other things, but it took me probably 3 years to get in. My worst day at Quantico was better than my best day elsewhere. So I was very happy to be in the FBI, and I'm very, very happy to have spent 20 years in the FBI. It's a fantastic career. You work with great people. The FBI's mission is to protect the Constitution and defend the American people. I mean, you can't get a better mission than that. So, yeah, no, I that's kind of my background.
And Bob showed up in Fayetteville, and I was his training agent.
That's right. So,
oh, really? So you guys you've been connected for a number of years now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, little did he know in 1998 he'd still be answering my questions in 2020.
And so what are you doing now, Bob?
I currently serve as the Chief Strategy Officer of a nonprofit company called the Cybercrime Support Network. And they have a mission, and it's very straightforward. It's to assist individuals and small businesses before, during, and after a cybercrime event. And our website, if anybody needs help with cybercrime events, is fraudsupport.org. Please look at all of our social media stuff on there, subscribe to our things, and if we can help you, we would certainly love to do that.
I will make sure to put a link to the website in the show notes for this episode. All right. So now how do we do this? Because I always like to give my guests the last word. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. I'll give you the last word.
There you go. Respect for your training agent.
You have to. He could tell you all the stupid things I did. I don't want that happening. Hopefully we covered this throughout the presentation, but working in an RA is a little bit different. And you cannot be successful in the FBI and a resident agency without the help and assistance of state, local, and other federal law enforcement agencies. And in the years that I was at the Fayetteville Resident Agency, I have nothing but good things to say about these other agencies that we work with. I mean, we talked about the Fayetteville Police Department. They have been fantastic. Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, City County Bureau of Investigation helped us, the U.S. Attorney's offices, and Army CID, and numbers of other agencies that we work with. And so they were all really, really fantastic. When we got there, it was me, Tim, two other agents, and a secretary, and covered 7 counties. Quite a bit bigger now, but there's no way you could be successful with just that number of people covering that large of an area without the help and assistance of the agencies that I mentioned. So RA is a great place to work. You get to work a large variety of cases. I just want to, tip my hat to all the other agencies. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tim.
Yeah, I would certainly echo very strongly what Bob had to say. I kind of take it one step further. As I think Bob mentioned at some point during the cast that, one of my primary responsibilities there at the RA was work in the military kind of cases. And I did that almost on a daily basis for the better part of 20 years. And Bob, when Bob was there, was the backup to that. So we have a lot of experience of working these military reservation government crimes kind of cases. I got to know literally probably hundreds of Army CID, military police investigators, military police guys. And, not only are these guys, serving their country in uniform, they're also performing, a thankless military police type investigative job for which they get little or no credit or thanks for. So I just want to emphasize the fact that, those guys are out there kind of doing double service, if you will. And on top of that, a lot of those guys became close personal friends of Bob and I that we still keep in touch with by email or LinkedIn or something like that, even today. So the personal side of it, in addition to the professional rewarding side of the investigations, made a lot of really great friends in those organizations that we like to say that are still friends today. And I think that's important to both Bob and I.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Timothy Gannon and Robert Burda, longer, more detailed bios for Tim and Bob, a newspaper article about this case, and several photos from crime scenes and sites discussed in this episode. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. and subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. I would love it if you also check out my books. My nonfiction, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And there's also my Philadelphia FBI Corruption Squad crime series. All of my books are available wherever books are sold. Please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.